In the dark and stormy seas of 1884, a merchant ship called the Mignonette was sailing from England to Australia. On board were 4 men, Thomas Dudley, Edward Stephens, Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy named Richard Parker. Their journey was perilous, and after days at sea, their ship sprung a leak, and they were forced to abandon it. The 4 men got into a lifeboat with some biscuits and a small amount of water, but within a few days, the water ran out, and they were left stranded in the middle of the ocean with no food or water. Can you imagine the desperation of these men? They were stuck in a tiny lifeboat, surrounded by water but unable to drink it. The sun beat down on them, and the only sound was the endless crashing of the waves. As the days passed, their hope began to dwindle. After 8 days in the lifeboat, poor Richard Parker, the young cabin boy, collapsed. Now, here's where the story takes a dark turn. Dudley and Stephens, driven by desperation and the need to survive, decided to kill Parker and eat his flesh. Brooks didn't participate in the killing, but he did eat some of the meat. After killing the cabin boy, their situation slowly began to turn around. They were eventually spotted, and a lifebuoy was sent to rescue them. When they were brought back to England, the 2 sailors, Dudley and Stephens, were charged with the murder of Richard Parker. But their defense was based on the idea of necessity. They claimed that they had no other choice but to kill Parker and eat his flesh to stay alive. The case went to trial, and the jury had to decide, were Dudley and Stephens guilty of murder? Could necessity be a defense to such a serious crime? In this video, we'll analyze this case using the IRAC method. Let's start with the facts. 4 sailors, including a teenager, were stranded at sea after their ship sank. They survived for 8 days on a lifeboat without food or water. The cabin boy died, and due to their extreme circumstances, 2 of the sailors killed the cabin boy and ate his flesh to survive. What was the legal issue in this case? The issue before the court was, can necessity be used as a defense to murder when the killing was done to save one's own life? In other words, can someone be justified in killing another person if it is necessary to save themselves? To answer this, we must look at the rule. The rule in criminal law is that murder is the unlawful killing of another human being with malice aforethought. In simpler terms, it means that if someone kills another person unlawfully and intentionally, they can be found guilty of murder. However, there are certain defenses that can excuse or justify a killing. One such defense is necessity. The defense of necessity excuses unlawful acts when there is an imminent threat of harm and the person causing the harm has no other option to avoid that harm. For example, if someone is trapped in a burning building and they break a window to escape, they may not be punished for the crime of breaking the window because they had to do it to save themselves from the fire. But the question in this case was whether the defense of necessity could ever excuse murder. The application of the law to the facts of the case is where things get interesting. Dudley and Stephens argued that killing Parker was necessary to preserve their own lives. They said that without food, they would all have died, and so they had no choice but to resort to cannibalism. However, the judges considered this argument carefully and pointed out that if they were starving and killing another person was the only way to survive, then they could have killed each other. It didn't have to be the cabin boy who died. Furthermore, they argued that allowing necessity as a defense in murder would create a dangerous precedent. If this were to become a valid defense, people could use it to justify killing innocent lives whenever survival was at stake. The judges made it clear that human life is sacred, and the law cannot permit the taking of one life simply to save another. Based on this, what was the conclusion reached in this case? The court ruled that necessity is not a defense to murder. Dudley and Stephens were found guilty and sentenced to death. However, their sentences were later reduced to 6 months in prison. Why is this case important? This case is important because it established a key principle in criminal law. No matter how extreme the situation, necessity cannot justify murder. Each human life is valuable, and the law will protect it. This brings us to the closing story beat. The Mignonette case is a tragic story of survival, morality, and law. It forces us to ask difficult questions about what people will do in desperate situations. But the legal principle is clear. The law recognizes the sanctity of human life and will not tolerate its violation even in the face of necessity. If you found this case brief helpful, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more case briefs. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.